The Parrot's Secret. The parrot my husband bought started repeating my father's name in a romantic tone, uncovering their hidden relationship, and as I stood frozen in our living room listening to the bright green bird coo, "Oh William, oh my sweet William," in a voice that was unmistakably my husband David's, I felt the ground beneath my feet turn to quicksand. The bird, a magnificent African gray named Aristotle that David had brought home just 3 days ago as a surprise anniversary gift, tilted its head and continued its devastating performance, adding a breathy sigh that I had thought was reserved for our most intimate moments, but apparently had been shared with my 62-year-old father. David walked in from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, his face lighting up when he saw me standing by Aristotle's cage, and he started to say something about how quickly the bird was learning to talk, but the words died on his lips when he saw my expression and heard what Aristotle was repeating. The parrot, oblivious to the destruction it was causing, ruffled its feathers and delivered the killing blow, perfectly mimicking David's voice saying, "William, I love you more than I've ever loved anyone, more than I thought possible," and then making kissing sounds that sent bile rising in my throat. I watched the color drain from David's face as he set the coffee cups down with shaking hands, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, and in that moment I saw our entire 5-year marriage recontextualize itself, every business trip he'd taken with my father, every late night at the office, every family dinner where they'd seemed unusually close. My father, William Chin, the man who had walked me down the aisle, who had given the toast at our wedding with tears in his eyes, who had welcomed David into our family with open arms, had apparently been welcoming him into more than just the family, and the thought made me want to scrub my brain with bleach. David took a step toward me, his hand outstretched, but I backed away, nearly knocking over a lamp in my haste to put distance between us, and Aristotle chose that moment to laugh, a perfect imitation of David's nervous giggle that I now realized I'd been hearing more and more lately. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by Aristotle occasionally muttering, "Beautiful William," or making soft kissing sounds, each repetition another nail in the coffin of my marriage and my relationship with my father, 2 of the most important men in my life revealed as liars and betrayers. I found my voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper, asking him how long, just those 2 words carrying the weight of all my questions, all my horror, all my desperate hope that there was some other explanation for what the parrot was revealing. David sank onto the couch, his head in his hands, and for a long moment he didn't answer, while Aristotle continued its performance, now adding, "Meet me in the conference room," and "Sarah doesn't suspect anything," which was my name, spoken like I was an obstacle to be navigated rather than a wife to be cherished. When he finally looked up, there were tears streaming down his face, and he started to speak, his words coming out in a rush about how it had started 18 months ago, how he had been struggling with his sexuality for years, how my father had been the one to approach him first after noticing his internal conflict. 18 months, I calculated quickly, that was right after my mother's death, when my father had been so lost and broken, when David had been spending extra time with him to help him through his grief, or so I had thought, but apparently grief counseling had turned into something else entirely. David kept talking, explaining how they had fought the attraction, how they had tried to stay away from each other, how the guilt had been eating them alive, but I could barely hear him over the roaring in my ears and Aristotle's continued revelations, now including, "Your skin is so soft," and other fragments of pillow talk I never wanted to hear. I thought about all the times I had pushed David to spend time with my father, worried that Dad was lonely after Mom died, grateful that they got along so well, proud that my husband was so caring and attentive to my family, never suspecting that their bond went far beyond son-in-law and father-in-law. The parrot squawked loudly and announced, "William's birthday surprise, hotel at midnight," and I remembered David's insistence that we should do something special for my father's birthday last month, how he had handled all the planning, how he had been gone for hours setting up what he said was a golf weekend surprise. My legs gave out and I sank into the armchair across from David, my mind racing through memories that all looked different now, tainted by this new knowledge, every smile between them suspect, every friendly touch potentially loaded with hidden meaning, every moment of the 3 of us together now feeling like I had been the third wheel in my own marriage. David tried to explain that he loved me, that our marriage was real, that what he had with my father was different but didn't diminish what we had, but his words sounded hollow, especially with Aristotle providing a soundtrack of "William, you're everything," and "Can't wait to hold you again," in the background. I asked him why he bought the parrot, why he would bring something into our home that could expose his secret, and he looked genuinely bewildered, explaining that Aristotle had been at the pet store for months, that he'd thought a talking bird would be fun, that he'd had no idea the creature had been absorbing his phone conversations through the thin wall between our home office and the spare room where he'd been making his calls. The irony was breathtaking, undone by his own gift, by a bird he'd bought to celebrate our anniversary, and I might have laughed if I wasn't so busy trying to keep from vomiting as Aristotle cheerfully announced, "William tastes like cinnamon," in David's unmistakable voice. I stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to get away from David's pleading eyes and the parrot's relentless revelations, and found myself in our bedroom, staring at our wedding photo on the nightstand, my father standing next to David, both of them smiling, and now I wondered when it had started, if the seeds were there even then. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed my father's face, the photo I'd taken of him last Christmas when he'd seemed so happy, finally healing from Mom's death, I'd thought, but now I wondered if his happiness had been about something else entirely, someone else entirely. I didn't answer, couldn't bear to hear his voice right now when I was still processing the fact that my husband and my father were lovers, that they had been carrying on an affair under my nose for over a year, that everyone in my life who mattered had been lying to me. David appeared in the doorway, still crying, trying again to explain, to minimize, to rationalize, but I held up my hand to stop him, not ready to hear more, not sure I would ever be ready to hear how the two men I trusted most in the world had betrayed me together. From the living room, Aristotle's voice drifted in, now reciting what sounded like poetry, "William, my unexpected love, my beautiful surprise," and I realized David must have been practicing romantic speeches, the kind he had never given me, the kind I had stopped expecting after the first year of marriage when romance gave way to comfortable routine. I pushed past David and returned to the living room, where Aristotle greeted me with, "Hello beautiful," which should have been nice except it was followed immediately by, "Not as beautiful as William though," and I had to resist the urge to open the cage and strangle the innocent bird. Instead, I grabbed my purse and my keys, ignoring David's protests and pleas for me to stay so we could talk, work through this, figure out what to do next, but I couldn't stay in that house another minute, couldn't breathe the air that was thick with deception and betrayal. I drove without destination, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind a chaos of images I didn't want to see, David and my father together, and the worst part was that I could picture it so easily. They were both handsome men, they made sense together in a way that made me feel invisible, erased. Eventually I found myself at my best friend Monica's house, standing on her doorstep unable to form words when she opened the door, and she took one look at my face and pulled me inside, guided me to her couch, made me tea, and waited for me to find a way to explain the unexplainable. When I finally told her, watching her face cycle through the same shock and horror I was feeling, she held me while I cried, ugly, body-shaking sobs that felt like they were turning me inside out, grieving not just my marriage but my relationship with my father, my sense of family, my understanding of who I was. Monica let me stay that night, setting me up in her guest room, and I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had missed the signs, if there had been signs, if I had been willfully blind or just trusting to the point of stupidity, unable to conceive that such a betrayal was possible. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and texts from both David and my father, but I turned it off, not ready to face either of them, not sure what I would say, what could possibly be said in a situation like this, when the betrayal was so comprehensive, so unexpected, so bizarre. The next morning, Monica convinced me to eat something, though the toast tasted like cardboard, and we sat at her kitchen table trying to make sense of what happened, both of us struggling to reconcile the David and William we knew with the secret lovers Aristotle had revealed them to be. I thought about my mother, grateful in a twisted way that she wasn't alive to see this, that she had died believing her husband of 35 years was devoted to her, never knowing that a year after her death he would be sleeping with their son-in-law, and I wondered if that made her lucky or just another victim of their deception. Monica asked what I was going to do, and I realized I had no idea. The situation was so far outside anything I had ever imagined dealing with that there was no playbook, no advice column that covered what to do when your husband is having an affair with your father, no support group for this particular betrayal. I knew I needed to go home eventually, to face the situation, to make decisions about my marriage and my family relationships, but I couldn't seem to make myself move, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of what had happened and what it meant for every aspect of my life. On the second day, Monica drove me home to get some clothes and essentials, and we found David still there, unshaven and red-eyed, Aristotle still cheerfully providing commentary with bits like "William's beard tickles" and "love you more than words," each phrase another twist of the knife. David tried to approach me, but Monica stepped between us, protective and fierce, while I grabbed what I needed, trying not to look at anything too closely, every object in our home now contaminated by the knowledge of what had been happening while I lived there obliviously. As I was leaving, David called out that my father was desperate to talk to me, that he was worried sick, that he loved me and never meant for any of this to happen, and I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that didn't sound like me, because how exactly does one accidentally fall into an 18-month affair with their daughter's husband? I moved into Monica's guest room temporarily, unable to face looking for my own place yet, unable to make any big decisions while my world was still spinning off its axis, and she gave me space to grieve while also making sure I ate and showered and didn't disappear entirely into my misery. A week passed before I finally answered one of my father's calls, his voice breaking when he heard mine, immediately launching into apologies and explanations, but I cut him off, telling him I wasn't ready to hear it, might never be ready to hear it, and hung up while he was still talking. David had apparently moved out of our house and was staying with his brother, who called me to express his shock and disgust at the situation, letting me know that I had his full support and that he was trying to talk sense into David, though we both knew there was no sense to be found in this situation. I contacted a divorce lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia who had seen everything in her career but still raised her eyebrows when I explained my situation, and she assured me that while the circumstances were unusual, the legal process would be straightforward, though she warned me about the emotional complications of divorcing someone who would likely remain in my life through my father. The thought of future family gatherings made me physically ill, imagining holidays and birthdays where I would have to see them together, knowing what I knew, and I wondered if I would have to cut my father out of my life entirely, orphaning myself by choice rather than circumstance. Patricia advised me to document everything, to save any evidence of the affair, and I realized with dark humor that my evidence was a parrot who wouldn't stop talking about it, who served as a living, breathing recording of my husband's infidelity, though she wasn't sure how that would play in court. I returned to the house when I knew David would be at work to pack more of my things, and found Aristotle alone in his cage, greeting me with, "Pretty bird, pretty William," and I stood there looking at this innocent creature who had destroyed my life simply by repeating what it had heard. Part of me wanted to blame the bird, to be angry at it, but I knew Aristotle was just doing what parrots do, mimicking sounds without understanding their significance, and the real blame lay with the two men who had created those sounds in the first place, who had built their secret love on the foundation of my trust. I fed Aristotle and cleaned his cage, listening to his continued revelations, which now included, "Divorce Sarah gently," and, "Wait 2 years then we can be together," suggesting they had actually discussed a future together, had made plans that involved discarding me like an inconvenient obstacle. The pain of that was almost unbearable, the idea that they had talked about me like a problem to be solved, a temporary impediment to their happiness, and I wondered how David could have shared my bed, made love to me, all while planning a future with my father. I took photos of Aristotle with my phone, videos of him saying the most damning phrases, building my case though I wasn't sure I would need it. David seemed prepared to give me whatever I wanted in the divorce, his guilt making him compliant, eager to minimize the damage he had caused. My father, on the other hand, kept trying to see me, showing up at Monica's house, leaving flowers and letters, sending messages through mutual friends, but I wasn't ready to face him, wasn't sure I ever would be. The betrayal from him somehow worse than from David because he had known me my whole life, had been my protector, my role model, my hero. The letters piled up unread until Monica convinced me to at least look at them, and I found pages and pages of my father's careful handwriting, explaining how lost he had been after Mom's death, how David had been there for him, how friendship had turned into something more without either of them meaning for it to happen. He wrote about the guilt that had consumed them both, how they had tried to end it multiple times, how he had considered moving away to remove himself from temptation, but couldn't bear to leave me, his only child, and I laughed bitterly at that because apparently he could bear to sleep with my husband but not to move to another city. David's letters were different, more focused on his sexuality struggle, how he had loved me, truly loved me, but had always felt something was missing, how meeting my father had awakened something in him he had tried to suppress his whole life, how he wished he had been brave enough to be honest before we got married. I wanted to feel sympathy for his struggle, to be the kind of person who could understand and forgive, but all I could feel was rage that he had used me as a cover, had built his life on the lie of our marriage, had dragged me into his journey of self-discovery without my consent or knowledge. 3 weeks after Aristotle's revelation, I agreed to meet David at a coffee shop to discuss the practical matters of our divorce, and seeing him was harder than I expected. This man I had loved, had planned a life with, now a stranger who had been living a double life I never suspected. He looked terrible, thin and hollow-eyed, and part of me was glad he was suffering too, that I wasn't the only one destroyed by this situation, though I knew his pain was different from mine, mixed with relief at no longer having to hide who he was, even if the revelation had come in the worst possible way. We discussed the division of assets, custody of Aristotle, who he apparently no longer wanted for obvious reasons, the house that neither of us could bear to live in anymore, all the mundane details of dismantling a life together while carefully avoiding talking about the elephant in the room, or rather the father in the bedroom. He tried once to bring up my father, to tell me how worried William was about me, how much he loved me, but I shut him down quickly, not ready to hear David speak about my father with any kind of intimacy or concern, not ready to acknowledge their continued connection. As we were leaving, he asked if I thought I could ever forgive him, and I told him honestly that I didn't know, that forgiveness felt impossibly far away, that right now I was just trying to survive each day without drowning in the betrayal, and he nodded, understanding that he had no right to ask for more. I kept Aristotle, strange as it was to have this living reminder of the affair, but I had grown attached to him despite everything, and he gradually learned new phrases, my voice teaching him, pretty bird, and good morning, until David's romantic declarations were diluted by normal parrot chatter. The divorce proceeded quickly, uncontested, and within 3 months I was legally single again, free from the marriage that had been built on a foundation of deception, though freedom felt hollow when it came with the loss of both my husband and my father, my two anchors in the world. My father's attempts to contact me continued but grew less frequent as months passed and I remained unresponsive, and I heard through family friends that he and David were still together, living quietly in David's new apartment, trying to build something real from the ashes of their deception. Part of me wanted to rage at the unfairness of it, that they got to be happy together while I was left to rebuild my life alone, but another part of me recognized that their happiness would always be tainted by how it began, built on the grave of my trust, haunted by the pain they had caused. I started therapy, trying to process the complex emotions of being betrayed by two people in such an interconnected way, and my therapist helped me understand that my father and David's sexuality wasn't the betrayal was the lies, the deception, the choice to pursue their relationship while I remained ignorant. Slowly, very slowly, I began to rebuild my life, finding a new apartment, throwing myself into work, reconnecting with friends I had neglected during my marriage, and discovering who I was when I wasn't defined as David's wife or William's daughter, just Sarah, whoever that turned out to be. Monica remained my rock through it all, and other friends rallied around me once the story got out, which it inevitably did in our small community, everyone shocked by the scandal but supportive of me, the innocent party in a situation that had no real villains, just people who had made terrible choices. A year after the revelation, I ran into my father at a grocery store, both of us freezing in the produce section like deer in headlights, and I was struck by how old he looked, how the guilt had aged him, this man who had once seemed invincible now fragile and uncertain. We stood there for a long moment, neither speaking, and then he said my name, just my name, with so much longing and sorrow that I almost broke, almost ran to him like I had as a child when the world was scary and he was my safe place, but I couldn't, because he was the one who had made my world scary now. I left without speaking, abandoning my half-full cart, and sat in my car in the parking lot crying for everything we had lost, for the relationship that could never be repaired, for the family that had been shattered by choices I still couldn't fully understand. That night, I finally read all his letters, really read them, and while they didn't excuse what he had done, they helped me understand it better, the loneliness after Mom's death, the unexpected connection with David, the guilt that had tortured them both even as they couldn't seem to stop what they were doing. I wrote him a letter in return, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement that I had hurt him, that I understood he hadn't meant to hurt me even though he had, that maybe someday we could find a way forward, though I couldn't promise when or how that might happen. He wrote back immediately, pages of gratitude and renewed apologies, promises to wait as long as it took, to respect my boundaries, to be whatever I needed him to be, even if that was nothing at all, and I filed the letter away, not ready to respond but not willing to throw it away either. Life continued its relentless forward motion, and I found surprising moments of happiness, laughter with friends, satisfaction at work, the simple pleasure of coming home to my own space where no one was lying to me, where Aristotle greeted me with phrases I had taught him, my voice replacing David's in his repertoire. I dated eventually, cautiously, always wondering if I would be able to trust again, if I would see deception where there was none, or worse, miss it where it existed. But gradually I learned to take people at face value again, to believe that not everyone was hiding earth-shattering secrets. 2 years after the revelation, I received an invitation to my cousin's wedding, and I knew my father would be there, possibly with David, and I had to decide whether I was ready to see them together in public, to acknowledge their relationship in front of family who all knew the story by now. I decided to go, bringing Monica as my +1 for moral support, and when I saw them across the reception hall, standing together but not touching, clearly trying to be respectful of my presence, I felt something shift in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but a loosening of the anger that had lived there for so long. My father approached me during the reception, alone, David hanging back, and we managed a brief, civil conversation about nothing important, the weather, my job, his health, carefully avoiding anything real, but it was a start, the first words we had exchanged in 2 years. David kept his distance, just nodding at me from across the room, and I appreciated that he understood our relationship was truly over, that whatever my father and I might rebuild, he and I would never be more than a painful chapter in each other's lives. The wedding was beautiful, my cousin radiant, and I found myself crying during the ceremony, not for what I had lost but for what still existed in the world, love that was honest and true, partnerships built on trust, families that supported each other without secrets and betrayal. That night, back in my apartment, Aristotle greeted me with, Sarah's home, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I had taught him my name, had replaced the painful memories his voice carried with new ones, had reclaimed my story from the narrative others had written for me. I thought about forgiveness, that complicated concept that everyone said I needed to find for my own peace, and realized that maybe forgiveness wasn't a destination but a journey, not a switch to be flipped but a gradual releasing of poison from my system, happening so slowly I barely noticed it. My father and I began exchanging Christmas cards, then birthday texts, then occasional emails about safe topics, and while we would never have the relationship we once had, we were building something new, fragile and careful but real, acknowledging that love could coexist with hurt, that family was complicated. David faded from my life entirely, just financial communications through lawyers about selling the house and finalizing remaining details, and I heard he and my father had moved to another city, starting fresh where their story wasn't known, where they could be just another couple rather than the scandal that broke a family. I kept Aristotle until he died peacefully of old age 8 years later, and by then his vocabulary was entirely mine, the painful phrases of the past replaced by years of my voice, my words, my life rebuilt on my own terms, and when he said, I love you, Sarah, in my own voice, I knew I had survived. Looking back now, 10 years after that terrible morning when a parrot revealed my life was a lie, I can see how it changed me, made me stronger but also more cautious, more independent but also more careful about who I let close, shaped by betrayal but not defined by it. I never married again, though I had relationships, good ones built on honesty and trust, and I found that I didn't need marriage to be complete, didn't need to define myself through partnership with someone else, could be whole and happy on my own terms. My father and I managed to rebuild a relationship of sorts, seeing each other a few times a year, always without David, maintaining boundaries that kept us both safe, and when he was diagnosed with cancer 5 years ago, I was there for him, not as the daughter I had once been but as the woman I had become. He died last spring, and at his funeral, David sat in the back, grieving the loss of his partner, and I found I could feel sympathy for his pain even while maintaining my distance, recognizing that their love, however it had begun, had become real and lasting, even if it had cost us all so much. He approached me after the service, and we spoke briefly, two strangers who had once promised to love each other forever, and he thanked me for being there for my father during his illness, for finding a way to forgive enough to give William that peace, and I realized that maybe that's what forgiveness really was, not forgetting but choosing to act with grace despite the hurt. I inherited my father's estate, including a letter he had written to be read after his death, in which he told me again how sorry he was, how proud he was of the woman I had become, how he hoped I knew that his love for me had never wavered even when his actions had betrayed that love, and I cried for all of us, for the pain we had caused each other, for the love that had survived despite everything. In the letter, he also left something for Aristotle, not knowing the bird had already passed, a trust fund for his care, and I donated it to a parrot rescue organization, thinking it was fitting that something good should come from the bird that had revealed so much pain, that other parrots should benefit from Aristotle's unwitting truth-telling. The house where it all happened was sold long ago, but sometimes I drive by it, looking at the windows where David used to make his phone calls, the walls that had hidden so many secrets, and I feel grateful that I no longer live there, that I have built a new life in spaces that hold no ghosts. I learned that truth has a way of revealing itself, that secrets rarely stay buried forever, that the universe sometimes sends messengers in the most unexpected forms, like a bright green parrot who just repeated what he heard, not knowing he was unraveling lives with every word. I learned that betrayal comes in many forms, that the people we trust most have the greatest power to hurt us, that love and deception can exist in the same space, that humans are capable of compartmentalizing in ways that seem impossible until you're faced with the evidence. I learned that survival is possible, that you can rebuild a life from ashes, that happiness can be found again even after devastating loss, that forgiveness is less about the people who hurt you and more about freeing yourself from the weight of carrying that hurt forever. Most importantly, I learned that I am stronger than I ever imagined, that I can face the unthinkable and survive, that I can choose grace over bitterness, that I can build a life of meaning and joy even when the foundation I thought I was building on turns out to be an illusion. The parrot my husband bought started repeating my father's name in a romantic tone, uncovering their hidden relationship, and in doing so, he freed me from a lie I didn't know I was living, forced me to confront truths that would have destroyed me slower if they had remained hidden, gave me the terrible gift of clarity in a situation built on deception. And now, a decade later, when people ask me about the most surprising thing that ever happened to me, I tell them about Aristotle, the accidental truth-teller, the feathered detective who solved a mystery I didn't know existed, the pet who changed my life by simply doing what parrots do, repeating the words he heard in the voices of those who spoke them. They usually think I'm joking at first, the story too strange to be real, but then they see my face and realize that truth really is stranger than fiction, that life can take turns no one could predict, that sometimes the most profound revelations come from the most unexpected sources. I keep a photo of Aristotle on my mantle, this bird who knew secrets he couldn't understand, who spoke truths he couldn't comprehend, who changed lives with his innocent mimicry, and sometimes I thank him for setting me free, even though the freedom came with such a terrible price. In the end, that's what he did, set me free from a marriage built on lies, from a family dynamic that was secretly toxic, from a future that would have been constructed on a foundation of deception, and while I wouldn't wish that kind of freedom on anyone, I'm grateful for the life I've built in its wake. The parrot my husband bought started repeating my father's name in a romantic tone, uncovering their hidden relationship, and in that moment, my life split into before and after, the before when I thought I knew who loved me and how, and the after when I learned that love is complicated, that truth is painful, that sometimes the greatest gift is the destruction of our illusions. And I survived, more than survived, I thrived, building a life of authenticity and purpose from the ruins of my marriage and family, proving that we are more resilient than we know, that we can face the unimaginable and emerge not unscathed but unbroken, scarred but still standing. That's the story of how a parrot ended my marriage and severed my relationship with my father, how an innocent bird became the catalyst for the complete upheaval of my life, how sometimes the truth finds a way to surface no matter how deeply it's buried, even if it has to come from the beak of an African gray who just wanted a cracker. It's a story I've told many times now, in therapy, to friends, to lovers who needed to understand why I am the way I am, and each time I tell it, it loses a little more of its power to hurt me, becomes just another part of my history, the chapter that led to all the chapters that came after. And when people ask if I regret buying Aristotle, if I wish I had never found out, I tell them no, that Livy.